All right, we're back with our favorite video of all time on this channel, I believe. The Jeep with the eating up fuel pump problems and the hard start, the cam crank code, all of the things from the previous videos. As far as the cam crank code, it's been over a week now, and we have not had a check engine light return on that code that we diagnosed the last time. But we're still not considering that a fix because Eric O., our friend that we referenced in the last video, watched that video and he noticed that I incorrectly did the cam sync timing with my scan tool. So there's a possibility that while we don't have any codes, technically it is not actually properly dialed in with the cam sensor signal. And we're going to go ahead and do that on another video and check that if indeed that is the case. But thanks, Eric, for pointing that out. I was unaware of that. But in this video, what we're going to do is fix two problems, hopefully simultaneously but unintentionally, because I think they're both going to be related with fuel pump. The vehicle has eaten up fuel pumps like every year, so an inordinate number of fuel pumps in a short period of time. We've got all kinds of reasons why that may be, and we'll list them up on the Dry Erase Board of Knowledge. Most of you guys agree with me, though. Most likely it's some type of sediment in the fuel tank or something like that that's clogging the pump, causing a strain. The pump has to work harder, and it burns out earlier. Obviously, electrical problem could cause that as well, and some other things, so we'll cover that. The other thing is, as we know in the previous video, there's a hard start with this truck that we ultimately found out appears to be a bad check valve in the fuel pump. As a matter of fact, I'm positive that's what it is. Technically, there could be two problems. We might have a bad check valve and also some type of prime command problem or electrical thing. And we'll kind of look into that, although I'm sure it's going to be a check valve thing. But as a part of diagnosing why this thing's burning fuel pumps, we're going to do some electrical tests anyway. So inadvertently, we'll come across that. Oh, and also this thing needs like a rear axle seal, but no brain work in that one. We're going to just do that off camera. But the one thing I did want to talk about with this hard start, because we're always using a logical, methodical process here, I want to address a little bit of the criticism I got on the last video from a few people. I think most people got what I was trying to do. Most people saw the logic procedure followed, but some people surprisingly didn't. And the thing is that a lot of people are thinking, well, I didn't even follow my own advice with the hard start using my fast tech method for diagnosing no start or hard start conditions, and why I didn't do that. And I would have diagnosed that this thing had a fuel pump problem or a problem with the fuel system easily, much earlier had I followed my own advice or had I followed a more logical procedure. And the thing is nothing could be further from the truth. People that are saying I should own up to the mistake or whatever, I didn't make a mistake. Actually, you guys are making the mistake. You're making a logic fallacy. And because this channel is all about the logical process of diagnosis, we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of a logic lesson so that it's clear on why that is. And I think it's not to be insulting or anything, or not to say you guys are wrong and I'm right. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people have a problem understanding that a logical, evidence-based diagnostic process is not always the fastest method. But it's still better than using an illogical process that happens to give you the answer right the first time. And we'll go ahead and explain that because I'm not going to change anything for this diagnosis. We've got multiple problems with the vehicle. I'm going to still use my same system, so it's important to understand that. What the hell? All right, so what we're going to do is use the DBOK, the Dry Erase Board of Knowledge here, and we're going to list the symptoms that we found in the previous video. So based on this evidence here, it's very clear that we've got some type of camera crank or timing problem, all of which, of course, can cause a hard start. So we've got the 1319, at least I think it was a 1319. It was a cam or crank signal loss, which, of course, can cause a hard starting problem. We also notice that the 1319 recurs with the starting. So in other words, if we clear the codes and we start the car and we get that hard start, immediately that 1319 code shows back up again. Now, in retrospect, we know this was because that crank sensor was loose, and when we're starting the car, it jiggles the crank sensor, causes the code. It actually really didn't have that much to do with the hard start. But we didn't know that at the time because we didn't see the crank sensor yet. We also saw from the freeze frame data that there was an outrageous timing advance, and also that we had normal long-term fuel trims with no adjustment. And a lot of people just dismissed the freeze frame data and ignored that evidence altogether anyway. There were also frequent misfires while driving the car, again indicative of a timing problem. Could also be indicative of a fuel problem, but again, we've got the normal long-term fuel trims with no adjustment. No reason to think that there's a fuel problem. As a matter of fact, a fuel problem is contraindicated. Of course, we have the hard start, and we also had an apparent loss of fuel command when I did that long cranking test trying to determine whether we were losing a cam or crank signal. Now, in retrospect, after reading at least one comment from somebody who's very familiar with the Jeep programming, I now know that that test actually was invalid because I have a better understanding of how that programming works. But at the time, nobody, including myself, knew what that programming was. At least nobody mentioned that in their comments when they thought that I should be chasing a fuel pump. And one other thing is I think a lot of people thought that I was trying to solve a hard start problem, which indirectly I was, but I think a lot of people missed that I was using that hard start as a tool to help me determine whether the cam or the crank was the problem. Remember, the 1319 code does not differentiate if we're losing signal from the cam or crank, or both, actually. And since the hard start was clearly connected with this, I was hoping to be able to use that hard start as a tool to determine, should I be chasing the cam or should I be chasing the crank? And a lot of people that just whiffed. But the point is that using a logical process, considering the code that we have, the misfires, the hard start, a logical process based on the evidence that we have would clearly dictate that you would expect the hard start to be caused by a timing problem. So in that case, I was using the fast tech method. The people that are saying I didn't use my own method, totally not true. I used the fast tech method, but of course, based on the evidence, I'm triaging that the timing would be the most likely. Now, that's a logical way of approaching it. I will tell you what is not a logical way of approaching it. And that is looking at this evidence and saying, oh, well, I think what you have is some kind of problem with your cam or crank or sensor or whatever, but you also have a bad check valve in your fuel pump. There's no indication of that whatsoever from this data. As a matter of fact, it's contraindicated. Notice I said that you would have a bad check valve with the fuel pump, not a bad fuel pump. Why? Because the normal long-term fuel trims again. And a lot of people just ignored this because actually they even admit they don't understand it. And that's where the problem lies. In a logical process, you are not allowed to dismiss data or evidence because you don't understand it. It's actually there's a name for it. It's a common classical logic fallacy. It's called argumentum ad ignorantium. And basically it means an argument from ignorance or an argument to ignorance. And there's different types of it. This specific one, I believe, would be an argument from incredulity, I believe it is, which basically translates to, I am dismissing this because I don't understand it or I find it hard to believe. You're not allowed to do that, sorry. Now, if you do that, it definitely makes things easier. One guy, for example, says, well, I just dismiss anything from a Jeep computer because those programmers don't know what they're doing and it just pumps out crap. Okay. First of all, it'd be interesting to see how he's going to chase the misfire, even if he fixed the hard start, if he's going to dismiss all the computer data. That would be fun to watch. And not to mention the fact that the computer was indeed dead on accurate. There was a crank sensor problem that the computer nailed right on. But the thing is, if we're going to use that guy's approach, oh, hell yeah, he's going to find that hard start problem much faster than I am, because he's just going to dismiss all the stuff that he doesn't understand. Of course, this would include with that. So based on that evidence, sure, he's going to go ahead and start doing a fuel pressure test and he's going to find the problem immediately. But you have to understand that it's still an illogical approach. A logical approach is not necessarily the fastest one. It's just the most comprehensive. So hopefully that kind of spells it out a little bit, but if not, that logic term that I use, the argument from incredulity, That actually, I have my own name for it. I call it the Autozone diagnosis method. And I see this every single weekend, and it drives me nuts. And this is when they do the code reader out in the parking lot. They come inside, they type in the code into their computer, and they get a document like this one. And the 98%er goes ahead and looks through the document, and he's shocked at how complex it looks. And he starts a cursory scan over it, and it says stuff like back probe the CMP signal circuit and look for signal. Well, I don't understand what that is. We'll eliminate that. Inspect the tone ring and do a power verification test shown in another thing. I don't understand that. We'll eliminate that. It says here, replace the cam position sensor. Okay, that I understand. And then here it's saying the same thing with the crank sensor. Well, I don't understand any of that stuff. Don't understand that. Replacing the crank sensor, I understand. Okay, so I either have to replace the crank sensor or the cam sensor. And that's the way they approach it. Now, the one thing about this method is that even though there's no evidence whatsoever to indicate a bad cam or crank sensor over any of the other evidence, if it turns out that, yes, it just happens to be you've got a bad cam or crank sensor, well, yeah, this method actually works better, doesn't it? It's a lot quicker, isn't it? But the problem is that if your problem is not your cam or crank sensor, you've got about an 80% chance of making a misdiagnosis. And again, that's the whole purpose of this channel, for you to understand all these other things that would normally be eliminated so that we can make a more comprehensive diagnosis, cover all the bases, and ensure that even if it takes a longer period of time, you will ultimately come up with exactly the correct diagnosis without possibly changing the wrong part. But anyway, a lot of people, they still get hung up on the fact that, well, if you'd have still just ignored all that other stuff, you would have solved the problem faster. I'll tell you what, I've got a story about that we'll do at the end of this video. That's actually kind of funny, and to be honest with you, it's kind of a story of my life every day at work, pretty much. But let's go ahead and get to this car, and we'll come back to that story later. It is actually pretty funny. Let's go ahead and approach these problems one at a time. So the first one is going to be the cranking problem, of course, which I believe is going to be a check valve. Let's go ahead and look at that first. And then we'll go ahead and look at the one that everybody's kind of hoping to see if they, guessed right on it. And that is why this thing might be eating fuel pumps up. So even if I find there's some type of wiring problem or something that might be causing the fuel pumps to burn up, a voltage drop or whatever, I've decided I'm still going to go ahead and drop this tank anyway, just because I want to eliminate the possibility that the tank also has sediment in it. It just seems reasonable that that could be a primary concern, especially considering the shoddy work that this guy's been getting. I have no question in my mind that they're replacing the fuel pumps in this thing without cleaning the tank out. And what I'm doing is I'm going to guarantee this guy a 3-year guarantee on his fuel pump and starting. If he has any fuel issues with this car, with the fuel pump for the next 3 years, I'm going to own up to it. So I'm going to drop that tank just to be sure that I can honor that warranty. All right, we get a jump start on the hard start problem. We already know this is fuel pressure related, so let's go ahead and do a key on, engine off prime. And let's see, we did not have any change at all in the fuel pressure. Let's go ahead and crank it and see what we get. Okay, we saw we actually built up pressure eventually there right when I gave up. Let's do that again. You notice how the pressure just drops right away. Again, indicative of a check valve problem. Let's get this thing started. Now we'll get it. Okay. We can see our fuel pressure is normal, and also I know it's normal under load and everything. So again, really not much indication there's a fuel pump problem, so much more a check valve. But my understanding is that the check valve is a component of the fuel pump on this system. One thing I will tell you, I did try to get the owner to get documentation for the fuel pump so that I could make a warranty claim on the fuel pump. And the shop said they did not have the information available, and I guess my guess is maybe they used a used component or something, but whatever the case is, we weren't able to do that, but I did try. Now watch when I go ahead and turn the engine off. and that pressure just drops instantly. Obviously, there's no check valve operation to maintain that pressure for the next start. All right, you see a little bit of longer crank time there, but a little bit of pressure in the rail was remaining there, but clearly a check valve problem. So one advantage that we have in this video versus the previous one is now we do know ahead of time that we are dealing with two unrelated problems. The hard starting, I don't believe, while it's going to be a check valve, I don't believe that's really related to whatever the problem is that this vehicle eats up a lot of fuel pumps. But our possible problems based on that information that a lot of people were saying we might have a priming failure. I don't think so. I heard the pump prime, and we're also going to do some electrical tests anyway as part of the eating the pump problem. So indirectly, we're going to validate that, but it's not a priming problem. Check valve, clearly. A bad fuel pump, again, the fuel trims are normal and it delivers normal fuel pressure under load. So we technically kind of don't have a bad fuel pump except for the fact that the check valve is bad. And then other people were mentioning some other things, could be auto shutdown things, stuff like that. Some people still saying it could be the cam timing off and things. But based on the pressure reading there and the fact that the vehicle never dies or stalls out or stops or anything, especially after fixing the crank sensor problem, we're really looking at the check valve here. But indirectly, we're also going to check the priming. As far as eating the fuel pumps, most of you guys agree with me that most likely debris in the tank, the most likely cause, but also some other good possibilities. Poor quality pump. This is especially true considering the shoddy work that this thing got. I actually suspect it may have got a used fuel pump personally in the previous time. So we'll have to check on that. We'll see what the brand of the fuel pump is or whatever. And the other thing, some people saying a voltage drop or some type of electrical problem could be causing the pumps to fail prematurely. Absolutely true, and we're going to go ahead and check that. It could be a combination of these problems, combined with the fact that this vehicle's got like 277,000 miles. Old, worn-out wiring, definitely a possibility. So I think the best thing to do is, there's a lot of ways of checking the priming from the top of the vehicle, and I've showed that before using the relay box or whatever. But since we've got to get under the vehicle anyway, let's go ahead and do some voltage checks underneath the vehicle right at the fuel pump. All right, normally I try to avoid these under car shots, but I've been fighting the last 5 minutes to get all this tape off of this connector here, wondering if they did some kind of wiring thing, or more likely they probably just broke the connector tab, I'm guessing. But figured we'd take a look here and see what we got here. And yeah, there, right there, the connector tab is broken. So I was hoping for something a little more exciting there. But yeah, that makes it easy to do disconnect the connector. But what we're going to do is, since I know we've got a prime, let's go ahead and leave that connected. And let's just go ahead and do a voltage drop test right now. All right, we'll go on the pump side here. I think will be the best thing just in case we've got bad connection. And for those of you not familiar with voltage drop test, I've got a diagnosis and understanding video that thoroughly explains it. Let's see here. We got 4 wires here. I remember last time, I'm pretty sure, I mean, just by looking at these wires, it's pretty obvious. This orange wire is going to be power and the black wire is going to be ground. So let's go ahead and back probe those. All right, let's see if we can get the voltmeter up in view here. Let's go ahead and prime the system. Yeah, this kind of reminds me of the first video I ever did. Okay, definitely heard the fuel pump prime, but I can't see the meter from up here, so I'm sure you guys did. I'll have to play back that video. All right, and just from that first prime test, we know we're going to be within spec for voltage drop. There's no doubt about it, but just to be complete about it, we're going to go ahead and measure our voltage from the source voltage during prime. All right, and just from that, we can determine that we've definitely got well under even 0.4 volts of voltage drop, so that's not going to be a factor for us worried about electricity frying the pump or something like that, so I'm going to go ahead and dismiss that. we're going to go ahead and drop this tank now. Incidentally, notice that on all the tests, we did definitely get a fuel pump prime. So we're really not worried about a lack of fuel prime command or anything. There's been no evidence of that whatsoever here. So we clearly just have a check valve problem for the hard start. So we're kind of doing a pretty good job of kind of killing two birds with one stone here. But what we're going to do is go ahead and drop that tank right now and do an inspection. And normally I wouldn't film this for safety reasons, but the evidence is just so irrefutable. But when I disconnect these fuel lines here, we're going to see that probably not even a trickle of fuel is going to come out. And you can see it's just totally dry, nothing coming out there. There's just no prime pressure at all there. Again, indicative of a check valve problem for sure here. All right, some of you guys have been waiting almost 5 months for this. Let's go ahead and see. All right, moment of truth here. And let's see what we get. All right, and already I'm kind of concerned about one thing here for sure. I noticed there's no strainer sock on the pump at all. And that's actually what I was expecting might be clogged. But let's go ahead and see if we can get you a look into this fuel tank here. But I actually don't see the strainer sock anywhere. I don't see a whole lot of small particulate matter like rust particles or anything that indicates that the sealant from the tank is wearing out and coming apart. But let's go ahead and drain this out and see if we can take a look at it and compare it with some clean fuel and see if we can tell any kind of a difference here. But actually there's quite a few more particles in here. That's interesting. Actually, you know what? There's a lot. You probably can't see it in the camera, but there is actually a bunch. It almost looks like bearing material from like if an engine goes bad. Let me see if I can focus in on this. So hopefully you can see that all floating around in there. But I can tell you, I always thoroughly clean the fuel pump lock before I remove it. And you can see that this is clearly not even just from removing that. Hopefully that's showing up in the camera, but I can tell you there is a bunch of stuff on the bottom of the tank there. And if I look at an angle, you won't be able to see this, but it's all the way across. So I'm pretty convinced that if there was a strainer sock on there, this certainly could present a problem. And I'm definitely not going to reuse that fuel pump, even though it's fairly new, because it's been sucking this stuff up. And this also means we're definitely replacing that fuel filter as well. I feel pretty confident if I wash this out really thoroughly, we're going to be able to live up to my 3-year guarantee for the repair on this thing. All right, so this made a real difference here. I got the fuel from the bottom of the fuel tank and sloshed it around, put it in a bucket, and I let it settle for about 10 minutes or so. And we can see easily that we've got a lot of sediment in that fuel. And this is just probably about, I don't know, a couple cups of fuel maybe, not even that. So obviously we've got a lot of sediment in the tank there. Wow, you can really see it there. So I'm pretty convinced we found the cause of the fuel pumps dying pretty frequently. Obviously, if the tank's always full of this stuff and it's never cleaned out, the strainer sock gets stuck, or the fuel filter also strains the pump. It has to work a lot harder. You would greatly decrease the life. And speaking of the pump, by the way, the identification tag on the pump here shows that it is a Chrysler part, a Chrysler pump. There's no way you're going to convince me that they bought a brand new OEM part from a dealer on a shop that's done the type of work that we've been seeing in the last few videos. No way. I'm convinced that this pump is a used pump that they've pulled from another Chrysler, and that is basically what I'm going to go with unless I see some evidence to the contrary. But whatever the case, you're definitely not going to convince me that this was a brand new part from 5 months ago, and you're also not going to convince me that I'm just going to go ahead and put this back in after it's been sucking up that dirty fuel for this long, especially without a strainer sock. And I'm convinced that I've got a strainer sock with the other pump. I wonder if it came with it. I thought it did. And yeah, here's my new pump. And you can see it actually has a strainer sock already installed. But anyway, this is why I've said in all of the videos where I've diagnosed a fuel pump that you don't just swap out a fuel pump. You always clean out the tank, and you also try to diagnose if there was a cause of the fuel pump failure. Classic example of why you want to do that, shown right here for you guys. We'll go ahead and install our new pump and get everything back together, and we'll go ahead and make sure that our starting problem is fixed, and we'll just have to see over the long term if we do fix the car eating the fuel pumps problem. So I'll go ahead and come back when I get that all done. We're just about done with this fuel pump install. All I got to do is tighten these nuts. Got him! All right, we've got a brand new fuel pump and filter installed. I've got about 5 gallons of fresh, clean gas in there. So let's go ahead and we'll start with a fuel pump prime. Probably take a couple of times to prime it since everything's totally empty. But let's go ahead and see if we can get a prime now. All right, we got a little bit of action there finally. So let's go ahead and try that again. And yeah, that's much better. Notice, by the way, also that it's holding the pressure, and that's exactly what I like to see. This vehicle is going to start right now, even with this low pressure right now. These things never stay put for me, I swear to God. All right, let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and turn it off and see if it holds our prime. Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Actually dropped quite a bit there, but I think that's okay. I'm not sure what specification is here. But the main thing is, from this point, I don't want to see it drop any within a couple minutes, and it's not. So this car is fixed. Let's just go ahead and start it up one more time just to have fun. Nice. Okay, and it again dropped back to the same pressure pretty much. So I believe that that's probably normal, and I'm really not worried about it. That's more than enough to get this car started. I'm going to go ahead and just watch it off camera. But again, this confirms this car is fixed. It's just a matter of if it can hold a fuel pump for more than a year now. We'll see. All right, and we kind of forgot to keep track of our thing here, but we know that we had a check valve problem for sure with the pump. And then as far as it eating up the pumps, technically we don't scientifically know for sure. Obviously, the evidence is very overwhelming that the debris in the fuel pump is certainly a contributing factor. But also, a poor quality pump could very much be a factor as well, because this guy over here is almost certainly a used pump, and probably the ones before it were. We really don't know. I'm actually kind of thinking maybe I can look up on the serial number and see the date of manufacture of this, but I can tell you, I will be blown away if they went out and bought an OEM fuel pump. But that is a possibility, and it doesn't really matter. The one thing we do know is that it wasn't a voltage drop or electrical problem. So it's been over an hour now. The fuel pressure is still reading awesome on the static. Let me just go ahead and swing around and show you. All right, so you can see it's just barely budged there. So that's awesome. The only thing really left to do on this, I need to finish up that axle seal. And then also, I want to go ahead and just check the cam timing, because I'm quite confident that that cam sensor was incorrectly installed by that shop. And we'll make another video out of that if that is still the case. I still need to check on the scan tool and verify that. But anyway, we'll go ahead and see what happens over time with the fuel pumps. And if something comes up, I'll certainly let you guys know. But it's also important to remember that for the guys that thought that the voltage drop or electrical problem was the issue, again, getting back to the start of the video, you are not wrong. In the world of logic, because the evidence pointed equally to all three of these things, and even possibly all three of them simultaneously, in fact, when we eliminate something that has a logical foundation, you're not wrong that you chose that as your first guess, so to speak. So if you're thinking, yay, I win because the debris in the tank was the cause, well, you don't, because actually there was just as much reason to believe the voltage drop. And actually, if anything, when you eliminate these, it just adds more evidence to what's left behind. So, you know, some people follow that, some people don't. But anyway, here's a story that I promised you that maybe will help to make it a little bit easier to understand. So this story literally actually happened to me 2 weeks ago. And actually this happens to me every day to some extent with my real job, but it definitely happened with an automotive sense 2 weeks ago. Woman calls me up. She says that her car is having trouble starting every morning. She has to jump start it every morning. It seems the battery dies overnight. This particular day, she can't start it at all. She's not sure the battery dead or what. Can I help her out? So I go ahead, pack up all my electrical stuff to look for voltage drop and battery load test and all that stuff and head over. I get to her house and her father's there, and he's kind of an elderly guy. He actually has like the walker with the little tennis balls in front of it. And to put this in perspective, he really seems to be a personification of Grandpa Simpson from the Simpsons cartoon. So the old guy kind of scoots up to us to see what's going on, and he asks, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the woman says, "Well, we're looking to see what's wrong with the car. It won't start." And he says, "When's the last time you charged the battery?" And she says, "Last night." And he says, "Turn on your headlights." She turns on the headlights. There's nothing. Completely dead. "Your battery's bad. You need a new battery." Well, of course, I know better, but I don't want to start anything with the guy. And I just told him, "Well, we'll see." So I go ahead, jumpstart the car for her, and then while it's running, I go ahead and test to see if there's alternator activity to make sure that the battery is getting a charge from the alternator. I use my electrical tester, and the old guy, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm just checking to make sure that the battery's getting charged." "The battery's not getting charged. The battery's dead. It's bad. Change the battery." Anyway, my measurements at the alternator show 14.6 volts, no question. Alternator is delivering charge to the battery. Now that the battery's charged for a little bit, I go ahead and see maybe there's a parasitic amp draw that's causing the battery to drain. Let's just rule that out to be sure. So for this, I break out my oscilloscope and my low amp probe to make it easy for myself. The guy sees me bring this fancy equipment out. "What is that?" I tell him, "It's an oscilloscope." "Oh, what?" "An oscilloscope. I'm just looking to see if anything's draining the battery." "Nothing's draining the battery. It's dead. How can anything drain the battery? You've got a bad battery. Change the battery." So at this point, I'm really kind of hoping that maybe there's an amp draw in here so I can kind of show this guy that he's wrong. But there is no amp draw. It's less than 20 milliamps. No problem with the amp draw at all. So then I decide it's time to go ahead and narrow down to a load test of the battery. So I set the charger up on the battery for about 15 minutes. The guy kind of goes around for a little walk, comes back, and about that time I'm ready to go ahead and load test the battery. So I set up my voltmeter, and the guy asks, "Now what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm just going to load test the battery just to see whether it's holding a charge or not." "Of course it's not. The battery's bad. Will you please just change the battery?" And of course, as you can imagine, I set my voltmeter up there. I go to turn the headlights on to do a load test. No sooner do I open the door, the accessory light activates, and the battery drops 2 cells, just like that. Voltage drops right away to like 8.4. No question about it. The only thing wrong with this car, a bad battery. And as the old man walks away, he's shaking his head and he says, "Man, I sure hope you don't plan on doing this for a living." Don't worry, old man. I don't have any intentions to. But the bottom line, no matter how you look at it, I took 25 minutes to make the call that that car only had a bad battery. The old man made the call in less than a half a second. And here I am, the one with a automotive diagnostic YouTube channel and not him. Go figure. Actually, I wonder what he would think of this channel if he saw it anyway. But whatever the case, hopefully we all learned something through this procedure. I know I learned something for sure, and that is I'm definitely going to start off with a visual inspection on any cam and crank codes. That's for sure. But whatever the case, however you approach your diagnosis, as long as you're not changing parts when you're doing whatever your process is, as far as I'm concerned, I guess that's probably just fine. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you found this helpful. We will see you next time.